Paris, November 23, 1654. The clock strikes 10:30 in the evening as Blaise Pascal sits alone in his study, surrounded by treatises on mathematics and natural philosophy that have made him one of Europe's most celebrated intellectuals at the age of 31. The room is lit only by candlelight and the glow from the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across geometric diagrams and algebraic equations that represent years of brilliant scientific work. But tonight, Pascal is not thinking about conic sections or atmospheric pressure or the mathematical principles that govern games of chance. Tonight, something extraordinary is happening to the man who once declared that the heart has its reasons which reason does not know. As he kneels in prayer, Pascal experiences what he will later describe as a direct encounter with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the abstract deity of philosophers and mathematicians, but the living God who speaks to the human soul. For 2 hours, from 10:30 until midnight, Pascal feels himself in the presence of divine fire that illuminates everything he thought he knew about truth, certainty, and the relationship between human reason and ultimate reality. With trembling hands, he takes up his pen and begins to write on a piece of parchment. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace. The words pour from him like equations solving themselves. But these are not mathematical formulas, they are the record of a soul transformed by an experience that transcends all the scientific knowledge he has accumulated through years of methodical investigation and logical analysis. This document, which Pascal will sew into the lining of his coat and carry with him for the rest of his life, marks the beginning of his transformation from a brilliant scientist into one of Christianity's most profound apologists and philosophy's most penetrating analysts of human nature. The man who had mastered the language of mathematics was discovering that the deepest truths about existence could not be calculated or proven but only experienced through faith, that required a kind of knowledge different from anything his scientific training had taught him to pursue. But Pascal does not abandon his commitment to rigorous thinking. Instead, he begins developing what will become one of the most sophisticated attempts in intellectual history to reconcile the demands of reason with the claims of faith, the certainties of mathematics with the uncertainties of existence, the clarity of scientific method with the mystery of spiritual experience. His Night of Fire will eventually produce the fragments of a planned apology for Christianity that would revolutionize how the modern world understood the relationship between intellect and belief. Consider the paradox. A man who had contributed to the foundations of calculus, probability theory, and computer science would spend his final years arguing that human reason was insufficient for addressing the most important questions about meaning and purpose. The mathematician who had helped establish the scientific revolution would insist that faith was not the enemy of reason, but its necessary complement for anyone seeking to understand what it means to be human in a universe that seems simultaneously rational and mysterious. Yet to understand how these apparent contradictions became sources of profound insight about the human condition, we must travel back to Clermont-Ferrand, where a child prodigy was learning that intellectual gifts could be both blessing and burden, providing access to extraordinary knowledge while raising questions about ultimate significance that no amount of scientific achievement could resolve. Blaise Pascal was born into a world where the foundations of knowledge were shifting beneath the feet of anyone brave enough to think seriously about the nature of reality. June 19, 1623, in Clermont-Ferrand, in the Auvergne region of central France, a time when Galileo's telescope was revealing that the heavens were not perfect and unchanging as medieval philosophy had taught, when Descartes was developing systematic doubt as a tool for discovering certain knowledge, and when Francis Bacon was arguing that careful observation and experimentation could unlock the secrets of nature that had remained hidden for millennia. His father, Etienne Pascal, embodied the intellectual curiosity and methodical approach to learning that characterized the educated elite of early 17th century France. A successful magistrate and accomplished mathematician, Etienne had abandoned his legal career to devote himself to his children's education and his own scholarly pursuits, demonstrating the kind of commitment to pure learning that Renaissance humanism had made respectable for men of means. The Pascal household became an informal academy where mathematical discussions were as common as conversations about politics or literature. Blaise's mother, Antoinette Bigon, died when he was 3 years old, leaving Tien to raise Blaise and his two sisters, Gilbert and Jacqueline, with the assistance of servants and tutors who shared the family's commitment to intellectual excellence. This early loss may have contributed to Pascal's lifelong preoccupation with human frailty and mortality, themes that would later inform his religious philosophy as powerfully as his mathematical insights shaped his scientific work. The educational experiment that Tien designed for his children reflected both confidence in human reason's capacity to understand the world and recognition that learning should be adapted to individual temperament and ability, rather than imposed through standardized curricula. Blaise received instruction in Latin, Greek, history, and philosophy, while being encouraged to pursue his own mathematical investigations with guidance, but not interference from his father, who recognized exceptional gifts that deserved careful cultivation, rather than rigid control. The France of Pascal's youth was experiencing intellectual revolution that would reshape European culture for centuries. The medieval synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology was being challenged by new discoveries in astronomy, physics, and mathematics that suggested the universe operated according to mathematical laws that could be discovered through human reason, rather than revealed through religious authority. This cultural transformation created both exciting opportunities and troubling questions for intellectuals who sought to understand their place in a cosmos that seemed simultaneously more comprehensible and more mysterious than their predecessors had imagined. Paris, where the Pascal family moved when Blaise was 8 years old, represented the center of this intellectual ferment. The capital attracted scholars, artists, and natural philosophers from throughout Europe, who gathered in salons and academies to discuss the latest discoveries and their implications for understanding everything from the motion of planets to the nature of human consciousness. Young Blaise absorbed this atmosphere of inquiry and debate while developing his own remarkable capacity for mathematical reasoning that would soon astonish even experienced scholars. The religious context of Pascal's upbringing combined traditional Catholic piety with the kind of intellectual sophistication that characterized educated French families of the period. The Pascals attended Mass regularly and observed the devotional practices of their social class, while maintaining the critical thinking that humanistic education encouraged. This combination of faith and reason was not perceived as contradictory, but as reflecting different aspects of complete human development that included both spiritual and intellectual formation. The scientific revolution that was transforming European understanding of the natural world during Pascal's youth created both intellectual excitement and philosophical anxiety for thoughtful observers who recognized that new knowledge was undermining traditional sources of authority while not yet providing stable alternatives. The telescope revealed that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Anatomical investigation showed that the human body was far more complex than medieval medicine had understood. Mathematical analysis suggested that nature operated according to precise laws that could be expressed in numerical formulas. The political circumstances of Pascal's early life included the religious wars that had devastated France during the previous century and the centralizing monarchy that was attempting to establish order through rational administration and royal authority. These historical developments provided practical examples of how human institutions could both serve and threaten individual welfare, while demonstrating the complexity of relationship.
Chapter 1. The prodigy emerges, the Pascal household on the Rue. Bersemish in Paris hummed with intellectual energy that transformed everyday conversation into mathematical discourse and routine family activities into opportunities for geometric investigation. 8-year-old Blaise absorbed this atmosphere of scholarly inquiry while displaying precocious understanding of numerical, relationships, and spatial concepts that astonished even his father, Etienne, who had considerable experience evaluating mathematical talent through his work with France's leading natural philosophers and his own advanced studies in algebraic theory and geometric analysis. Etienne's pedagogical philosophy reflected Renaissance confidence in human reason's capacity for discovering truth through systematic investigation, while recognizing that exceptional talents required careful cultivation, rather than standardized instruction that might suppress originality in favor of conventional achievement. He delayed Blaise's formal introduction to mathematical study until age 12, believing that premature exposure to abstract concepts might interfere with the development of intuitive understanding that provided the foundation for genuine mathematical insight rather than mere computational facility. But Blaise's mathematical curiosity could not be suppressed by paternal caution, however well-intentioned. At age 11, while playing alone in his father's study, he began investigating the properties of triangles and polygons, using only his own observations and logical reasoning. Without access to Euclid's Elements or other standard mathematical texts that Etienne had deliberately kept from him, within weeks, the boy had independently discovered several fundamental propositions of plane geometry, including the theorem that the sum of angles in any triangle equals to right angles. When Etienne discovered his son's unauthorized mathematical investigations, he faced a dilemma that reflected broader questions about the relationship between natural talent and systematic education that occupied much intellectual discussion during the period. Should exceptional ability be channeled through conventional pedagogical methods that had proved successful with ordinary students? Or did genius require freedom to pursue its own insights, even at the risk of developing intellectual habits that might prove difficult to integrate with established scholarly disciplines? The decision to accelerate Blaise's mathematical education by introducing him to advanced geometric texts and allowing him to attend meetings of Marin Merson's scholarly circle demonstrated Etienne's recognition that his son possessed extraordinary gifts that deserved extraordinary opportunities, despite the potential dangers of exposing a young mind to intellectual challenges that might prove psychologically overwhelming or socially isolating. Merson's Academy, which met regularly to discuss the latest developments in mathematics, natural philosophy, and theological questions raised by scientific discoveries, provided Blaise with his first exposure to the collaborative nature of serious intellectual work, while revealing how individual brilliance could contribute to collective understanding when guided by appropriate scholarly mentors and methodological constraints that prevented investigation from degenerating into mere speculation or personal fantasy. The mathematical problems that occupied Merson's circle during Blaise's early participation included questions about the properties of cycloids, the mathematics of probability, and the relationship between geometric analysis and physical reality that would later influence his own original contributions to mathematical science. These discussions taught him that mathematics was not merely an abstract intellectual exercise, but a powerful tool for understanding the natural world and solving practical problems that affected human welfare. Blaise's first original mathematical discoveries emerged from his attempt to extend Euclidean geometry to include properties of conic sections that classical authors had not fully explored. His essay on conic sections, written when he was 16, demonstrated not only remarkable technical skill, but also innovative approaches to mathematical proof that would influence subsequent development of projective geometry and analytical methods that became essential tools for scientific investigation. The recognition that Blaise's mathematical work received from established scholars like Pierre de Fermat and René Descartes provided validation of his exceptional abilities, while introducing him to the competitive dynamics that characterized intellectual life among Europe's leading thinkers. These early encounters with scholarly criticism and peer review taught him about the standards of rigor and originality that serious mathematical work required, while revealing how intellectual achievement could become a source of both satisfaction and anxiety. The family's social position improved significantly as Blaise's reputation grew, demonstrating how intellectual distinction could provide opportunities for advancement that traditional aristocratic privilege might not have afforded. Invitations to court, correspondence with leading scholars, and recognition from religious and political authorities created new possibilities while imposing obligations to use exceptional gifts in service of broader cultural and spiritual purposes that mere personal achievement could not satisfy. The psychological pressures that accompanied early recognition of mathematical genius included expectations for continued innovation and discovery that might prove impossible to sustain throughout a normal career, as well as social isolation that resulted from intellectual interests and abilities that separated Blaise from age peers who lacked comparable analytical skills or scholarly motivation. These early experiences of being simultaneously celebrated and isolated would profoundly influence his later reflections on human nature and social relationships. The religious questions that began occupying Blaise's attention during his teenage years reflected both the intellectual sophistication that mathematical training had provided and the existential concerns that exceptional ability sometimes generated among individuals who recognized their own cognitive limitations despite public recognition of their achievements. Mathematical certainty could be achieved within carefully defined logical systems. But questions about ultimate meaning and purpose seem to require different approaches to knowledge that purely rational methods might not be able to provide. The relationship between mathematical thinking and spiritual development that would become central to Pascal's mature philosophy began emerging during this period, as he recognized that the same intellectual abilities that enabled geometric proof and algebraic manipulation could be applied to theological and moral questions. Though perhaps with different results than scientific investigation typically achieved, the precision and clarity that mathematics required provided training for rigorous thinking about any subject. But ultimate questions about meaning and value might not admit the kind of definitive resolution that mathematical problems offered to sufficiently skilled investigators. The family's financial security, which Etienne had established through careful investment and competent estate management, provided Blaise with intellectual freedom that might not have been available to someone who needed to pursue mathematics as a practical career rather than as pure research directed toward advancing human understanding regardless of immediate practical applications or commercial possibilities. This independence would prove essential for the kind of original work that established Pascal's permanent reputation as both mathematician and philosopher. The recognition that intellectual gifts created moral obligations as well as personal opportunities began shaping Blaise's understanding of his responsibilities as someone whose analytical abilities might contribute to human welfare. Through discoveries that could benefit others as well as satisfy his own curiosity about the mathematical structure of reality, this sense of intellectual vocation would eventually lead him to consider how mathematical reasoning might be applied to theological questions and moral problems that seemed at least as important as purely scientific investigations. Blaise Pascal was learning that mathematical genius was both blessing and burden.
Access to extraordinary knowledge about the rational structure of the universe,
while raising questions about ultimate significance that no amount of technical mastery could resolve through purely analytical methods. The prodigy who could solve geometric problems that challenged mature scholars was beginning to wonder whether human reason, however powerful, was adequate for addressing the most important questions about existence and purpose that intellectual sophistication inevitably generated for anyone who thought seriously about their place in the cosmos.
Chapter 2. The Mechanical Calculator in 1642. When Blaise Pascal was 19 years old, he undertook a project that would establish him as one of the founding fathers of computer science, while providing practical demonstration of how mathematical principles could be applied to solving real-world problems that affected thousands of people's daily lives. His father Etienne had been appointed Royal Tax Commissioner for Rouen, a position that required processing enormous quantities of numerical calculations related to tax collection, customs duties, and financial record-keeping that consumed weeks of tedious arithmetic computation performed by clerks whose errors could result in significant financial losses for both the government and individual taxpayers. Observing his father's frustration with the slow and error-prone methods available for performing complex calculations, Blaise conceived the idea of creating a mechanical device that could automate arithmetic operations through precisely engineered gear systems that would eliminate human computational errors while dramatically reducing the time required for financial analysis and bookkeeping tasks that were essential for effective government administration and commercial enterprise. The design challenges that confronted Pascal in creating his Pascaline acquired him to integrate advanced mathematical understanding with practical knowledge of metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and mechanical engineering that he had to acquire through careful study of existing clockwork mechanisms and consultation with skilled craftsmen who possess the technical expertise necessary for fabricating components accurate enough to perform reliable arithmetic operations through purely mechanical means. The theoretical principles underlying Pascal's calculating machine drew on his understanding of the decimal number system and positional notation that enabled complex numerical relationships to be represented through precisely calibrated physical mechanisms that could perform addition, subtraction, and with some modifications multiplication through gear ratios and carry mechanisms that translated mathematical concepts into mechanical processes that operated according to the same logical principles that governed abstract numerical manipulation. The construction process that occupied Pascal for 3 years required him to design and redesign numerous prototypes, while working with clockmakers and metalworkers whose traditional skills had to be adapted to meet the unprecedented precision requirements of a machine that needed to function reliably for thousands of operations while maintaining accuracy sufficient for financial calculations, where small errors could accumulate into significant discrepancies that would make the device worse than useless for practical applications. The intellectual satisfaction that Pascal derived from solving the engineering problems involved in creating a working calculating machine demonstrated how mathematical thinking could be applied to practical challenges that affected human welfare while providing personal fulfillment that came from successfully implementing theoretical insights through physical mechanisms that transformed abstract concepts into tangible devices capable of performing useful work. The commercial prospects that Pascal envisioned for his calculating machine included sales to government agencies, commercial enterprises, and educational institutions that could benefit from faster and more accurate arithmetic computation. But the high cost of manufacturing precision mechanical devices limited the market to wealthy individuals and organizations that could afford to purchase expensive equipment for performing calculations that skilled clerks could accomplish using traditional methods, albeit more slowly and with greater risk of error. The social implications of mechanical calculation included concerns about technological unemployment among clerks and bookkeepers whose livelihood depended on their ability to perform arithmetic operations that machines might eventually execute more quickly and reliably, raising questions about the relationship between technological progress and human welfare that would become increasingly important as industrial development transformed traditional approaches to production and employment. The philosophical questions that Pascal's calculating machine raised about the relationship between human intelligence and mechanical processes would later influence his thinking about the nature of consciousness and reasoning, as he recognized that many mental operations that seemed to require conscious thought could actually be performed by appropriately designed physical mechanisms that operated according to deterministic principles without awareness or understanding of their own operations. The recognition that Pascal's calculating machine received from the French Academy of Sciences and other learned institutions established his reputation as an inventor and practical mathematician, while demonstrating how theoretical knowledge could be applied to solving concrete problems that served broader social purposes beyond mere intellectual curiosity or academic advancement that might satisfy scholars without benefiting ordinary people who lacked access to advanced education. The technical limitations that prevented widespread adoption of Pascal's calculating machine included the difficulty and expense of manufacturing precision mechanical components using 17th-century materials and tools, as well as the need for regular maintenance and repair that required specialized knowledge not readily available in most locations where such devices might prove useful for commercial or administrative purposes. The correspondence that Pascal maintained with other inventors and natural philosophers throughout Europe regarding his calculating machine provided opportunities for intellectual exchange about the principles of mechanical computation, while revealing how technological innovation depended on collaborative efforts that transcended national boundaries and institutional affiliations through shared commitment to advancing human knowledge and practical capability. The patents that Pascal obtained for his calculating machine represented early examples of intellectual property protection for technological innovations, establishing legal principles that would become increasingly important as industrial development created valuable inventions whose commercial exploitation required protection from unauthorized copying by competitors who might benefit from others' research and development efforts without bearing the costs of original innovation. The educational value that Pascal's calculating machine provided included its demonstration of how mathematical principles could be embodied in physical mechanisms that made abstract concepts tangible and comprehensible to individuals who might lack formal mathematical training, but could understand how gear systems and mechanical processes operated according to logical principles that were essentially similar to algebraic and arithmetic operations. The influence that Pascal's calculating machine would have on subsequent development of mechanical and electronic computation included its establishment of fundamental design principles and engineering approaches that would be developed further by inventors like Gottfried Leibniz and Charles Babbage. who built on Pascal's insights while creating more sophisticated devices that could perform increasingly complex calculations through mechanical and eventually electronic means. The personal satisfaction that Pascal derived from successfully creating a working calculating machine provided practical validation of his mathematical and engineering abilities, while demonstrating how intellectual gifts could be applied to solving real problems that affected human welfare. Though he was also beginning to recognize that technological achievement, however impressive, might not address deeper questions about meaning and purpose that no mechanical device could resolve through purely rational operations. Blaise Pascal's calculating machine had established him as one of the founders of computer science while demonstrating how mathematical insight could be transformed into practical technology that served human needs. But the experience also raised questions about the relationship between mechanical processes and conscious thought that would later influence his philosophical investigations into the nature of human reason and its limitations when confronted with ultimate questions about existence and value that seemed to require different approaches to knowledge than purely rational analysis could provide.
Chapter 3. Experiments in the Void in 1646. Blaise Pascal became obsessed with a question that would lead him to revolutionize physics while providing crucial insights into the nature of experimental science and the relationship between theoretical hypotheses and empirical investigation. The question concerned the existence of vacuum-empty space containing no material substance, which Aristotelian natural philosophy had declared impossible on the grounds that nature abhors a vacuum, but which recent experiments by Italian scientists suggested might actually exist under certain carefully controlled conditions. The intellectual context for Pascal's investigations included the work of Evangelista Torricelli, who had discovered that mercury in a glass tube would rise to a height of about 30 inches when the tube was inverted over a dish of mercury, leaving an apparent void above the mercury column that could not be filled with any known substance, yet seemed to be genuine empty space rather than containing some invisible material that escaped detection through available observational methods. The experimental apparatus that Pascal designed to test competing theories about vacuum represented significant improvements over Torricelli's original equipment, incorporating longer tubes, different liquids, and more precise measuring instruments that could detect smaller variations in liquid height while providing better control over experimental conditions that might affect results in ways that could confuse interpretation of data or lead to false conclusions about the physical phenomena under investigation. The theoretical implications of Pascal's vacuum experiments extended far beyond immediate questions about atmospheric pressure to fundamental problems about the nature of matter, space, and physical forces that govern natural phenomena, challenging Aristotelian assumptions about natural place and elemental motion that had provided the foundation for medieval natural philosophy, while suggesting that mathematical analysis might provide more reliable guidance for understanding physical reality than purely logical reasoning based on traditional philosophical principles. The social dimensions of Pascal's experimental work included his collaboration with other natural philosophers who shared his interest in discovering how nature actually operated, rather than accepting inherited authorities that might be incorrect, demonstrating how scientific investigation required collective effort and mutual criticism among researchers who could verify each other's observations, while developing increasingly sophisticated experimental techniques and theoretical interpretations. The religious questions that Pascal's scientific work raised concerned the relationship between natural law and divine providence, as mathematical regularities discovered through experimental investigations seemed to suggest that God operated through consistent rational principles rather than arbitrary supernatural interventions, while the apparent existence of vacuum challenged theological assumptions about divine omnipresence that required every part of creation to contain some manifestation of divine power or influence. The practical applications that emerged from Pascal's atmospheric pressure research included improved methods for predicting weather changes and designing more efficient pumping mechanisms for mining operations, demonstrating how pure scientific investigation could produce benefits for human welfare, even when motivated primarily by intellectual curiosity, rather than immediate practical concerns about technological improvement or commercial advantage. The philosophical implications of establishing vacuum's existence included fundamental questions about the nature of space and time that would later influence development of modern physics. as the recognition that empty space could exist independently of material objects suggested that spatial relationships might be more basic than substance in determining the structure of physical reality, anticipating concepts that would become central to relativistic and quantum mechanical theories centuries later. The experimental methodology that Pascal developed through his vacuum research established important principles for conducting reliable scientific investigations, emphasizing the need for careful control of variables, precise measurement of results, and systematic variation of experimental conditions to test specific hypotheses, rather than conducting random observations that might generate interesting but inconclusive data without advancing theoretical understanding of the phenomena under investigation. The correspondence that Pascal maintained with other European scientists regarding his vacuum experiments provided evidence of the emerging international scientific community that shared information and technical innovations across national and religious boundaries, while maintaining common standards of evidence and reasoning that enabled collaborative progress despite differences in cultural background, institutional affiliation, or personal philosophical commitments that might otherwise prevent effective intellectual cooperation. The public demonstrations that Pascal organized to display his experimental results served important educational functions while helping to establish experimental science as a legitimate form of knowledge that could supplement, rather than replace, traditional scholarly methods, showing how empirical investigation could provide insights into natural phenomena that were not available through purely rational analysis, but required direct observation and measurement under carefully controlled conditions. The technological innovations that Pascal's vacuum research required included development of more precise glassworking techniques, improved methods for creating airtight seals, and better instruments for measuring small changes in pressure and liquid height, demonstrating how scientific investigation often drove technological advancement while benefiting from engineering improvements that made more sophisticated experiments possible through enhanced precision and reliability of experimental apparatus. The institutional support that Pascal received for his experimental work came primarily from informal networks of natural philosophers rather than established academic institutions, reflecting the fact that experimental science was still emerging as a legitimate scholarly discipline that required new forms of organization and funding to support research activities that were often expensive and time-consuming while not fitting easily into traditional university curricula or ecclesiastical educational programs. The theoretical controversy that Pascal's vacuum experiments generated among traditional natural philosophers revealed deep disagreements about proper methods for investigating natural phenomena, and the relative authority of empirical observation versus logical reasoning in determining truth about physical reality. Anticipating larger conflicts between experimental science and scholastic philosophy that would characterize intellectual development throughout the scientific revolution. The personal satisfaction that Pascal derived from his experimental work included both the intellectual excitement of discovering new knowledge about natural phenomena and the practical pleasure of designing and building apparatus that could reveal previously hidden aspects of physical reality, though he was also beginning to recognize that scientific investigation, however successful, might not address ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that seemed to require different approaches to knowledge than purely empirical methods could provide. Blaise Pascal's experiments in the void had established fundamental principles of atmospheric pressure and pneumatic technology while demonstrating the power of experimental science to reveal previously unknown aspects of natural reality. But the experience also raised questions about the relationship between scientific knowledge and ultimate truth that would later influence his philosophical investigations into the limitations of human reason when applied to questions about meaning, purpose, and the relationship between material and spiritual dimensions of existence.
Chapter 4: Worldly Success and Inner Emptiness. By 1650, 27-year-old Blaise Pascal had achieved everything that ambitious young intellectuals of his era could reasonably hope to accomplish: international recognition for mathematical innovations, successful inventions that demonstrated practical application of theoretical knowledge, membership in exclusive scholarly circles, and social connections that provided access to the highest levels of French intellectual and political culture. Yet despite these remarkable achievements, Pascal found himself experiencing what he would later describe as a profound sense of spiritual emptiness that no amount of worldly success could satisfy or eliminate. The mathematical research that occupied much of Pascal's attention during this period included work on probability theory that emerged from his correspondence with Pierre de Fermat about questions raised by gambling enthusiasts who wanted to determine fair ways to divide stakes when games were interrupted before completion. Their exchange of letters established the mathematical foundations of probability analysis, while revealing how abstract mathematical concepts could be applied to practical decision-making under conditions of uncertainty that characterized many aspects of human experience beyond mere games of chance. The social environment of Parisian intellectual life provided Pascal with opportunities for conversation and collaboration with some of Europe's most brilliant minds, while exposing him to the competitive dynamics and personal rivalries that often characterized relationships among highly accomplished individuals who sought recognition for their achievements while struggling to maintain collegial cooperation in pursuit of knowledge that supposedly transcended personal ambition and professional jealousy. The religious atmosphere of Pascal's family during this period reflected conventional Catholic piety that emphasized regular observance of religious duties without necessarily requiring the kind of personal spiritual transformation that might challenge established patterns of thought and behavior, enabling educated individuals to maintain both intellectual sophistication and religious respectability without confronting potential conflicts between scientific knowledge and theological doctrine that more intensive spiritual commitment might reveal. The literary activities that Pascal began pursuing during his late 20s included experiments with essay writing and philosophical reflection that would later develop into the pensiers, but at this stage represented primarily intellectual exercises rather than expressions of profound spiritual concern about ultimate questions regarding human purpose and destiny that would eventually motivate his mature religious philosophy and apologetic work. The health problems that began affecting Pascal during this period included the chronic pain and digestive difficulties that would plague him for the rest of his life, providing unwelcome education in human frailty and mortality that complemented his intellectual understanding of physical and mathematical principles, while raising questions about the relationship between mind and body that purely rational analysis seemed unable to resolve satisfactorily. The romantic relationships that Pascal may have considered during his late 20s remain historically obscure, but evidence suggests that he was capable of forming emotional attachments while maintaining the intellectual independence and scholarly dedication that seemed to require forms of personal autonomy that might be difficult to reconcile with the domestic obligations and emotional commitments that marriage typically involved for individuals of his social position. The financial security that Pascal's family had achieved through Tien's prudent investments and Blaise's own intellectual achievements provided freedom from immediate economic pressures while creating opportunities for pursuing pure research and cultural activities that might not have been available to someone who needed to earn a living through more conventional professional employment, though material comfort could not address deeper questions about meaning and purpose that mere financial stability left unresolved. The political involvement that Pascal's mathematical reputation brought him included occasional consultation with government officials who sought expert advice on technical questions related to taxation, engineering projects, and administrative procedures that could benefit from mathematical analysis, providing practical experience with how intellectual expertise could serve public purposes while revealing the limitations of rational problem solving when applied to complex political and social issues. The philosophical discussions that occupied Pascal's attention during his participation in Parisian intellectual circles included debates about the relationship between reason and faith, the nature of scientific knowledge, and the implications of recent discoveries for traditional approaches to understanding human nature and cosmic order. Conversations that would later influence his mature thinking about the proper scope and limitations of rational inquiry when applied to ultimate questions about existence and value. The cultural activities that provided relaxation and social stimulation for Pascal included attendance at theatrical performances, musical concerts, and literary salons, where educated Parisians gathered to discuss contemporary developments in arts and letters while maintaining the kind of sophisticated conversation that demonstrated both intellectual refinement and social status appropriate to individuals who had achieved distinction through scholarly achievement rather than inherited privilege. The scientific correspondence that connected Pascal to natural philosophers throughout Europe provided ongoing intellectual stimulation while revealing how collaborative investigation could advance human knowledge through shared commitment to empirical methods and mathematical analysis. Though such cooperation also raised questions about whether purely rational approaches to understanding reality could address all aspects of human experience that seemed to require knowledge about meaning and purpose, as well as efficient and final causes. The recognition that Pascal received for his intellectual achievements included honors from scholarly academies, invitations to court, and correspondence from distinguished thinkers who sought his opinions on theoretical questions, providing external validation of his exceptional abilities while failing to satisfy deeper psychological needs for meaningful activity that could justify the investment of extraordinary intellectual gifts in pursuit of goals that might prove ultimately insignificant despite their immediate practical or theoretical value. The growing awareness that worldly success could not provide lasting satisfaction led Pascal to begin questioning fundamental assumptions about the relationship between intellectual achievement and human happiness, preparing the ground for the spiritual crisis that would eventually transform his understanding of what constituted authentic human fulfillment and appropriate use of exceptional intellectual abilities in service of goals that transcended merely personal satisfaction or professional recognition. The social obligations that accompanied Pascal's rising reputation required increasing amounts of time and energy devoted to maintaining relationships and fulfilling expectations that might interfere with the solitary reflection and intensive study that serious intellectual work required, creating tensions between public recognition and private spiritual development that would become increasingly difficult to resolve through conventional approaches to balancing competing claims on his attention and commitment. Blaise Pascal was discovering that intellectual achievement and social success, however gratifying initially, could not provide lasting satisfaction for individuals who possess the kind of psychological complexity and spiritual sensitivity that exceptional ability sometimes generated, preparing him for the religious conversion that would redirect his extraordinary intellectual gifts toward questions about ultimate meaning that no amount of worldly accomplishment could address through purely rational methods or conventional social activities. Chapter 5. The Convert. On the night of November 23, 1654, Blaise Pascal experienced what he described as a direct encounter with the living God that would transform him from a brilliant but spiritually indifferent intellectual into one of Christianity's most profound apologists and penetrating analysts of the human condition. This mystical experience, which lasted approximately 2 hours, provided him with certainty about divine reality that no amount of rational argument or scientific investigation had been able to achieve, while simultaneously revealing the limitations of purely intellectual approaches to ultimate questions about meaning, purpose, and the relationship between temporal existence and eternal significance. The circumstances that preceded Pascal's conversion included his growing dissatisfaction with the conventional religious observance that characterized his family's Catholic practice, combined with his exposure to Jansenist theology through his sister Jacqueline's spiritual development and his own reading of theological works that emphasized the necessity of divine grace for authentic spiritual transformation, rather than mere moral improvement that individuals might achieve through their own efforts and good intentions. The intellectual preparation that enabled Pascal to appreciate the significance of his mystical experience included his thorough familiarity with both classical philosophy and contemporary scientific method, which provided him with sophisticated criteria for evaluating different forms of knowledge, while recognizing that direct spiritual awareness involved modes of certainty that neither logical demonstration nor empirical investigation could provide or validate through conventional scholarly methods. The psychological impact of Pascal's conversion created fundamental changes in his priorities and commitments that affected every aspect of his subsequent intellectual and personal development. As he began applying his extraordinary analytical abilities to theological questions and apologetic arguments while maintaining the rigorous standards of evidence and logical consistency that had characterized his mathematical and scientific work, though now directed toward defending religious truth rather than advancing purely secular knowledge, The immediate aftermath of Pascal's conversion included his decision to record the experience in writing and preserve this account throughout the rest of his life by sewing it into his clothing, demonstrating his recognition that the spiritual transformation he had undergone required permanent reminders and conscious effort to maintain against the psychological pressures and social expectations that might gradually erode religious commitment, if not deliberately sustained through disciplined practice and regular reflection. The theological framework that Pascal adopted through his conversion emphasized the absolute dependence of human beings on divine grace for salvation and authentic spiritual development, rejecting both Pelagian optimism about natural human goodness and Protestant confidence in justification through faith alone, while maintaining Catholic commitment to sacramental grace, mediated through ecclesiastical institutions that provided necessary spiritual resources for sustained religious life. The practical consequences of Pascal's religious transformation included significant changes in his daily routines and social relationships, as he began participating more actively in religious observances while reducing his involvement in secular intellectual activities that had previously consumed most of his time and energy, though without abandoning his commitment to rigorous thinking about questions that could benefit from mathematical and scientific methods of analysis. The literary projects that emerged from Pascal's conversion included his initial work on what would become the Pensiers, fragmentary reflections on human nature and religious truth, that applied his analytical skills to defending Christianity against skeptical objections while demonstrating how rational argument could support rather than undermine religious faith, when properly understood and appropriately applied to questions about ultimate meaning and purpose. The social challenges that Pascal faced following his conversion included maintaining relationships with intellectual colleagues and family members who did not share his religious enthusiasm, while avoiding both self-righteous judgment of others' spiritual conditions and hypocritical compromise of his own religious convictions for the sake of social harmony or professional advancement that might undermine authentic spiritual commitment. The philosophical questions that Pascal's conversion raised about the relationship between reason and faith would occupy much of his remaining intellectual energy, as he sought to demonstrate how rational analysis could reveal the limitations of human knowledge while pointing towards spiritual truth that transcended purely intellectual understanding without contradicting logical consistency or empirical evidence when properly interpreted and applied. The influence of Jansenist theology on Pascal's religious development included appreciation for Augustine's insights into the necessity of divine grace, while maintaining suspicion of both Protestant individualism and Jesuit accommodations to worldly values that seemed to compromise essential Christian teachings about sin, grace, and the radical transformation that authentic conversion required rather than gradual moral improvement that might leave fundamental spiritual problems unresolved. The mystical dimensions of Pascal's conversion experience provided him with direct awareness of divine reality that could not be communicated through rational argument alone, but required forms of witness and testimony that combined intellectual sophistication with spiritual authenticity, enabling him to address both scholarly and popular audiences while maintaining credibility among educated skeptics who might otherwise dismiss religious claims as mere superstition or wishful thinking. The psychological integration that Pascal achieved through his conversion enabled him to reconcile his exceptional intellectual abilities with his spiritual commitments by recognizing that reason and faith address different aspects of human experience and knowledge, both necessary for complete understanding, but neither sufficient alone for addressing ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that required synthesis of rational analysis with spiritual insight and personal transformation. The moral implications of Pascal's conversion included recognition that intellectual gifts created special responsibilities for service to others, rather than merely personal satisfaction or professional advancement, leading him to consider how his mathematical and scientific expertise might be applied to apologetic purposes that could help other educated individuals overcome skeptical objections to religious faith, while maintaining intellectual integrity and scholarly standards. The educational value that Pascal extracted from his conversion experience included insights into the relationship between intellectual humility and spiritual growth that would influence his later writing about human nature and the conditions necessary for authentic self-knowledge, as he recognized that pride in rational achievement could become an obstacle to spiritual development, while genuine intellectual sophistication might actually facilitate religious understanding when pursued with appropriate moral and spiritual preparation. Blaise Pascal's conversion had provided him with spiritual certainty that no amount of intellectual achievement could have supplied, while redirecting his extraordinary analytical abilities toward questions about ultimate meaning and purpose that purely secular scholarship seemed unable to address adequately through rational methods alone, preparing him for the apologetic work that would establish his permanent reputation as one of Christianity's most intellectually sophisticated defenders and penetrating analysts of the human condition. Chapter 6: The Provincial Letters. In January 1656, the theological controversy known as the Jansenist dispute provided Blaise Pascal with an opportunity to demonstrate how his extraordinary literary and analytical skills could be applied to religious polemic while establishing new standards for satirical prose that would influence French literature for centuries. Writing under the pseudonym Louis de Montalti, Pascal published a series of 18 provincial letters that defended Jansenist theology against Jesuit accusations of heresy while exposing what he considered dangerous moral compromises that threatened the integrity of Christian ethics and spiritual life. The immediate context for Pascal's intervention in this theological dispute included the condemnation of several Jansenist propositions by the Sorbonne and papal authorities, based on accusations that Antoine Arnauld and other Port-Royal theologians were teaching Protestant-influenced doctrines about grace and predestination that undermined Catholic teaching about free will, sacramental efficacy, and the necessity of good works for salvation, charges that Pascal considered both theologically inaccurate and politically motivated. The literary strategy that Pascal employed in his provincial letters involved creating a fictional correspondent who wrote to a friend in the provinces explaining the theological controversies that were agitating Parisian intellectual and religious circles, enabling Pascal to present complex theological arguments in accessible language while using ironic humor and satirical observation to expose what he considered intellectual dishonesty and moral corruption among his Jesuit opponents. The philosophical foundations underlying Pascal's defense of Jansenist positions included his commitment to Augustinian theology that emphasized human dependence on divine grace, while rejecting both Pelagian optimism about natural human goodness and Protestant minimizing of sacramental and institutional means of grace, positions that required careful theological analysis to distinguish from superficially similar Protestant doctrines that Catholic authorities were attempting to suppress. The moral arguments that formed the core of Pascal's attack on Jesuit casuistry focused on what he considered dangerous relaxation of ethical standards through sophisticated reasoning that enabled wealthy and powerful individuals to avoid serious moral obligations while maintaining the appearance of religious respectability, a form of spiritual corruption that Pascal believed threatened the authentic Christianity that demanded genuine conversion and practical holiness rather than mere intellectual sophistication. The rhetorical techniques that Pascal perfected through his provincial letters included the use of apparent naivety and genuine puzzlement to expose logical contradictions and moral inconsistencies in his opponent's positions, creating satirical effects through understated irony rather than direct attack, while maintaining scholarly standards of accuracy in quotation and argumentation that protected him from charges of misrepresentation or personal slander that might discredit his theological criticisms. The social impact of Pascal's provincial letters extended far beyond immediate theological controversies to include their influence on public opinion about religious authority and institutional corruption, as educated readers throughout Europe discovered how literary excellence could be combined with serious religious argument while maintaining intellectual standards that satisfied both popular and scholarly audiences who might otherwise remain indifferent to purely technical theological disputes. The theological sophistication that Pascal demonstrated through his provincial letters revealed his thorough mastery of patristic sources, scholastic methods, and contemporary controversies, while showing how mathematical precision and logical rigor could be applied to religious questions without reducing spiritual truth to mere rational demonstration or eliminating mystery and paradox that seemed essential features of authentic Christian doctrine and spiritual experience. The political implications of Pascal's intervention in the Jansenist controversy included his challenge to Jesuit influence at court and in educational institutions, while defending the independence of theological scholarship from political pressure and royal authority that might compromise intellectual integrity for diplomatic convenience or dynastic interests that had little relationship to genuine religious concerns about truth and spiritual welfare. The literary achievement that Pascal's provincial letters represented included their establishment of French prose as a vehicle for serious intellectual discourse that could rival Latin in precision and elegance, while remaining accessible to educated general readers who lacked specialized theological training but possessed sufficient cultural sophistication to appreciate both literary artistry and logical argumentation when skillfully combined in defense of important principles. The psychological insights that Pascal incorporated into his provincial letters included penetrating analysis of how intellectual pride and institutional loyalty could corrupt moral judgment, while revealing the self-deception mechanisms through which individuals justified behaviors that violated their own stated principles. Observations that drew on his growing understanding of human nature derived from both scientific investigation and spiritual reflection. The international influence that Pascal's provincial letters achieved through translation and circulation throughout Protestant as well as Catholic Europe demonstrated how skillful religious polemic could transcend sectarian boundaries while advancing broader cultural discussions about the relationship between reason and faith, individual conscience, and institutional authority, moral rigor and pastoral accommodation that affected all Christian communities regardless of their specific denominational commitments. The educational value that Pascal's provincial letters provided included their demonstration of how complex theological arguments could be made comprehensible to general audiences without sacrificing intellectual rigor or scholarly accuracy, establishing models for religious education that could serve both popular instruction and academic investigation, while maintaining appropriate respect for both human reason and divine mystery that authentic Christian teaching required. The ecclesiastical consequences of Pascal's provincial letters included their contribution to the eventual papal condemnation of Jesuit casuistry while failing to prevent the continued persecution of Jansenist communities. Outcomes that taught Pascal about the limitations of purely intellectual approaches to institutional reform, while confirming his growing conviction that authentic religious life might require forms of spiritual commitment that transcended conventional theological and political categories. The personal satisfaction that Pascal derived from writing the provincial letters included both literary pride in achieving unprecedented combination of satirical humor with serious religious argument and spiritual confidence that he had defended important Christian principles against corruption and compromise. Though the experience also revealed how polemical writing could become a form of intellectual pride that might interfere with genuine spiritual development if not properly disciplined through prayer and moral self-examination. Blaise Pascal's provincial letters had established new standards for religious polemic while demonstrating how literary excellence could serve apologetic purposes that defended essential Christian truths against intellectual corruption and institutional compromise. But the experience also taught him about the limitations of purely controversial writing for promoting positive spiritual development that might require different approaches to combining reason and faith in defense of ultimate truth that transcended partisan theological disputes. Chapter 7: The Mathematics of Belief. Between 1656 and 1659, as Pascal continued his work on defending Christian faith against skeptical objections while maintaining his commitment to intellectual rigor and scientific methodology, he developed what would become one of philosophy's most famous arguments: the mathematical analysis of religious belief, known as Pascal's wager. This revolutionary approach to theological questions applied principles of probability theory and decision analysis to the problem of religious choice, demonstrating how rational calculation could support faith commitment even when absolute certainty about God's existence remained impossible to achieve through purely logical or empirical methods. The intellectual context for Pascal's development of the wager argument included his growing recognition that traditional approaches to proving God's existence through rational demonstration had failed to convince sophisticated skeptics while potentially undermining genuine faith by suggesting that religious commitment should depend on philosophical arguments that most believers could not understand or evaluate independently. rather than on spiritual transformation and practical wisdom that remained accessible to individuals regardless of their educational background or intellectual abilities. The mathematical foundations underlying Pascal's wager drew on his pioneering work in probability theory to analyze religious choice as a decision problem under uncertainty, where individuals must choose between belief and unbelief without definitive evidence about God's existence, while facing potential consequences that vary dramatically depending on both the truth about divine reality and the practical effects of religious commitment on individual character development and social relationships. The logical structure of Pascal's argument proceeded by examining four possible combinations of belief or unbelief and God's existence or non-existence, while calculating the expected value of each choice based on estimated probabilities and potential outcomes, demonstrating that rational self-interest supported religious commitment, even if the probability of God's existence was relatively small, provided that the consequences of belief and unbelief differed significantly in their impact on human welfare and eternal destiny. The philosophical sophistication that Pascal brought to his analysis of religious choice included recognition that belief could not be produced directly through rational argument, but required what he described as custom and habit to dispose the mind and heart toward faith, acknowledging psychological realities about how religious conviction actually developed while maintaining that reason could demonstrate the wisdom of seeking such transformation, rather than remaining in skeptical indifference that might prevent spiritual development. The theological dimensions of Pascal's wager reflected his Augustinian conviction that genuine faith required divine grace, while human beings remained responsible for creating conditions that might facilitate such grace through prayer, moral discipline, and participation in religious practices that could gradually transform consciousness and character, even if initial participation was motivated by prudential calculation rather than authentic spiritual conviction. The practical implications of Pascal's approach to religious choice included specific recommendations about how skeptics might begin cultivating faith through participation in religious observances, moral behavior, and contemplative practices that could provide experiential foundation for beliefs that purely rational argument could not establish with sufficient certainty to motivate life-changing commitment, demonstrating how reason could serve faith without eliminating mystery or reducing religion to mere intellectual exercise. The psychological insights that informed Pascal's analysis of religious belief included his understanding of how human beings actually made important decisions under conditions of uncertainty, recognizing that most significant life choices involved elements of risk and commitment that transcended purely rational calculation, while benefiting from careful analysis of available evidence and potential consequences that could inform judgment without determining it completely. The moral arguments that Pascal incorporated into his wager analysis included claims that religious belief typically promoted virtues like humility, compassion, and moral discipline that enhanced human character regardless of metaphysical questions about God's existence, while skeptical indifference might encourage pride, selfishness, and moral complacency that corrupted individual development and social relationships, even if religious doctrines proved ultimately false. The social considerations that influenced Pascal's approach to religious apologetics included his recognition that institutional Christianity provided community support and cultural resources for moral development that purely individual philosophical reflection might not be able to supply, while secularization and religious skepticism could undermine social bonds and cultural traditions that contributed to human flourishing in ways that abstract rational analysis might not fully appreciate or adequately replace. The epistemological questions that Pascal's wager raised about the relationship between reason and faith included fundamental problems about how human beings could achieve reliable knowledge about ultimate questions when empirical investigation and logical demonstration seemed inadequate for resolving metaphysical disputes that nonetheless required practical decisions about how to live and what values to pursue in circumstances where complete certainty remained impossible to achieve through purely intellectual methods. The literary techniques that Pascal employed in presenting his wager argument included dialogue, paradox, and rhetorical question that engaged readers' imagination and moral sensibility while maintaining logical rigor and mathematical precision, demonstrating how apologetic writing could appeal to both rational and emotional dimensions of human nature without sacrificing intellectual honesty or scholarly standards that educated audiences required for serious consideration of religious claims. The cultural influence that Pascal's wager would exercise on subsequent European thought included its contribution to discussions about rational choice theory, risk assessment, and decision-making under uncertainty that extended far beyond purely theological applications, while establishing precedents for mathematical approaches to ethical and practical questions that would influence development of economics, political science, and moral philosophy for centuries. The personal significance of the wager argument for Pascal's own spiritual development included its function as intellectual justification for religious commitment that he had already embraced through mystical experience, providing rational support for faith that could satisfy his mathematical training, while acknowledging limitations of purely intellectual approaches to spiritual truth that required forms of knowledge and transformation beyond what logical argument alone could provide. The limitations that critics would identify in Pascal's wager included questions about whether religious commitment motivated primarily by prudential calculation could constitute authentic faith, whether the argument assumed too much about the character and existence of God, and whether similar reasoning might support other religious traditions as effectively as Christianity. Issues that revealed ongoing tensions between reason and faith that Pascal's analysis had illuminated rather than fully resolved. Blaise Pascal's mathematical analysis of religious belief had demonstrated how probability theory and rational decision-making could support faith commitment while acknowledging the limitations of purely intellectual approaches to spiritual questions. Establishing new approaches to religious apologetics that combined scientific methodology with theological sophistication in defense of Christian truth that transcended but did not contradict human reason when properly understood and appropriately applied to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. Chapter 8. The Anatomy of Human Nature. In his mature philosophical reflections, which would eventually be assembled posthumously as the Pens Es, Pascal undertook the most penetrating analysis of human nature that European thought had yet produced, combining his scientific understanding of physical reality with his religious insights into spiritual truth to create a comprehensive portrait of human beings as creatures suspended between animal instinct and angelic intellect, capable of both extraordinary greatness and profound misery that reflected their unique position in the cosmic hierarchy as rational beings who remained irreducibly dependent on forces beyond their control or complete understanding. The anthropological framework that Pascal developed drew on classical sources, contemporary scientific knowledge, and his own psychological observations to identify what he considered the fundamental characteristics of human nature that distinguished human beings from both purely material entities and purely spiritual substances, emphasizing the paradoxical combination of grandeur and wretchedness that made human existence simultaneously glorious and tragic, rational and mysterious, capable of achieving remarkable understanding while remaining subject to illusions and limitations that no amount of intellectual sophistication could completely eliminate. The psychological analysis that formed the core of Pascal's human portrait included detailed investigation of how consciousness operated through imagination, memory, and reasoning that could achieve genuine insights while remaining vulnerable to systematic deceptions that resulted from both external circumstances and internal psychological dynamics, revealing how human beings could simultaneously be capable of mathematical demonstration and scientific discovery while falling victim to superstitions and self-deceptions that contradicted their own rational principles and empirical knowledge. The social dimensions of Pascal's anthropological investigations revealed how human beings were fundamentally shaped by relationships with others while remaining essentially isolated in their individual consciousness, creating perpetual tensions between the need for community recognition and the desire for authentic self-knowledge that could never be fully resolved through either social conformity or individual autonomy, but required forms of wisdom that transcended purely secular approaches to identity formation and moral development. The moral insights that Pascal extracted from his analysis of human behavior included recognition that people typically acted according to complex mixtures of rational calculation and emotional impulse, that made purely rational approaches to ethics inadequate for understanding actual moral choice, while revealing how genuine virtue required forms of spiritual transformation that mere intellectual understanding of ethical principles could not provide through willpower or philosophical education alone. The religious implications of Pascal's human portrait emphasized what he described as the God-shaped hole in human consciousness that created perpetual restlessness and dissatisfaction that no amount of worldly achievement or intellectual understanding could permanently satisfy, suggesting that human beings were constituted in ways that pointed towards spiritual truth and divine relationship as necessary conditions for authentic fulfillment, rather than merely optional additions to otherwise complete natural development. The epistemological questions that Pascal raised about human knowledge included fundamental problems about the relationship between rational demonstration and practical wisdom, showing how human beings could achieve mathematical certainty about abstract relationships while remaining uncertain about the most important questions regarding meaning, purpose, and appropriate conduct that required forms of judgment that combined logical analysis with spiritual insight and moral sensitivity that purely rational methods could not generate independently. The literary techniques that Pascal employed in presenting his anthropological analysis included aphorism, paradox, and psychological observation that captured essential features of human experience in memorable formulations that combined intellectual precision with imaginative power, demonstrating how philosophical investigation could be conducted through literary methods that engage readers' moral imagination while maintaining scholarly standards of accuracy and logical consistency. The historical consciousness that informed Pascal's understanding of human nature included appreciation for how cultural circumstances affected individual development while recognizing universal patterns in human behavior that transcended particular social arrangements, enabling him to use contemporary examples and classical sources to illustrate timeless features of human psychology that remained relevant across different periods and cultural contexts, despite variations in external conditions and institutional frameworks. The scientific perspectives that Pascal incorporated into his human studies included insights from his mathematical and physical investigations that revealed both the remarkable rational capacity of human consciousness and its limitations when confronted with questions about meaning and value that seemed to require different approaches to knowledge than purely empirical investigation could provide, suggesting complementary rather than competitive relationships between scientific and spiritual approaches to understanding reality. The therapeutic implications of Pascal's psychological analysis included practical guidance for individuals seeking authentic self-knowledge and moral development through methods that combine rational self-examination with spiritual disciplines, recognizing that genuine human flourishing required both intellectual honesty about personal limitations and religious faith that could provide resources for transformation that purely secular approaches to moral education might not be able to supply adequately. The political dimensions of Pascal's anthropological investigations revealed how individual psychological dynamics affected social relationships and institutional development, while showing how collective arrangements could either support or undermine authentic human development, providing frameworks for evaluating different forms of government and social organization based on their effects on individual character formation, rather than merely their efficiency in maintaining order or promoting material prosperity. The aesthetic considerations that influenced Pascal's presentation of his human portrait included attention to literary beauty and rhetorical effectiveness that made philosophical insights accessible to educated general readers while maintaining intellectual sophistication that could satisfy scholarly audiences, demonstrating how serious philosophical investigation could be conducted through forms of expression that achieved artistic excellence without sacrificing analytical rigor or empirical accuracy. The educational implications of Pascal's understanding of human nature included recognition that authentic learning required both intellectual development and moral formation that addressed the whole person, rather than merely transmitting information or developing technical skills, suggesting approaches to education that could cultivate both rational capacity and spiritual sensitivity while respecting individual differences in temperament and ability that made standardized curricula inadequate for serving diverse educational needs. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's anthropological insights included their applicability to modern psychological research and therapeutic practice that continued to discover patterns in human behavior that confirmed many of his observations about consciousness, motivation, and moral development, demonstrating how 17th-century philosophical investigation could anticipate findings that would be validated through subsequent scientific investigation, while maintaining insights about spiritual dimensions of human experience that purely empirical methods might not be able to address adequately. Blaise Pascal's Anatomy of Human Nature had provided one of the most comprehensive and psychologically penetrating accounts of the human condition that European thought had yet achieved. Combining scientific precision with literary artistry and theological sophistication to create a portrait of human beings that acknowledged both their remarkable capacities and their fundamental limitations, while pointing toward forms of spiritual development that could address the deepest needs and highest aspirations that characterized authentic human existence. Chapter 9. The Art of Persuasion. As Pascal worked on developing his comprehensive apology for Christianity that would eventually become the Pensias, he devoted considerable attention to questions about how religious truth could be communicated effectively to different audiences while maintaining intellectual integrity and avoiding the manipulation or coercion that might produce false conversions rather than genuine spiritual transformation. His reflections on the art of persuasion drew on his literary experience with the provincial letters, his mathematical understanding of probability and logic, and his psychological insights into human nature to develop sophisticated approaches to religious communication that respected both rational and emotional dimensions of human consciousness. The theoretical foundations for Pascal's approach to religious persuasion included his recognition that different individuals required different forms of argument and evidence, depending on their intellectual background, psychological temperament, and spiritual development, acknowledging that effective communication needed to begin with accurate understanding of audiences' actual beliefs, concerns, and motivations rather than imposing standardized approaches that might fail to address real obstacles to faith, while potentially creating additional barriers through inappropriate methods or unrealistic expectations. The psychological principles that guided Pascal's thinking about persuasion emphasized the importance of addressing both rational and emotional aspects of human nature, while recognizing that intellectual conviction and spiritual transformation involved different processes that required coordination rather than competition, showing how logical demonstration could prepare the mind for faith, while spiritual disciplines could dispose the heart toward beliefs that reason alone might not be able to establish with sufficient certainty to motivate life-changing commitment. The rhetorical strategies that Pascal developed through his apologetic writing included the use of indirect argument that allowed readers to discover truth through their own reflection rather than accepting conclusions on external authority, creating conditions where intellectual pride could be bypassed through apparently casual observations and questions that gradually revealed the inadequacy of purely secular approaches to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. The literary techniques that Pascal employed in his religious communication included aphorism, paradox, and imaginative scenario that engaged readers' moral sensibility while providing memorable formulations of complex ideas that could continue influencing thought long after initial reading, demonstrating how artistic excellence could serve apologetic purposes without sacrificing either intellectual rigor or spiritual authenticity that genuine religious education required. The philosophical sophistication that Pascal brought to questions about religious communication included his understanding of epistemological problems about how human beings could achieve reliable knowledge about ultimate questions when empirical investigation and logical demonstration seemed inadequate for resolving metaphysical disputes that nonetheless required practical decisions about how to live and what values to pursue in circumstances where complete certainty remained impossible through purely rational methods. The social considerations that influenced Pascal's approach to religious persuasion included his recognition that individual spiritual development occurred within cultural contexts that provided both opportunities and obstacles for faith, requiring apologetic strategies that could address collective as well as personal barriers to religious commitment while respecting legitimate concerns about institutional corruption and intellectual freedom that might make traditional religious authorities seem untrustworthy to educated audiences. The pedagogical principles that Pascal applied to religious education emphasize the importance of beginning with shared assumptions and common experiences, rather than immediately introducing controversial doctrines that might provoke defensive reactions before proper groundwork had been established. Showing how effective teaching required careful attention to psychological and social factors that affected learning, as well as logical presentation of evidence and argument. The theological commitments that shaped Pascal's understanding of religious communication included his conviction that genuine conversion required divine grace, while human beings remained responsible for creating conditions that might facilitate such grace through prayer, moral discipline, and intellectual honesty that eliminated barriers to spiritual development while avoiding presumption about divine action that remained ultimately mysterious and beyond human control or manipulation. The cultural analysis that informed Pascal's apologetic strategy included his understanding of how Enlightenment rationalism and scientific materialism were affecting educated European attitudes toward religious authority and supernatural claims, enabling him to develop arguments that could appeal to individuals who valued intellectual autonomy, while showing how faith could enhance rather than threaten rational inquiry when properly understood and appropriately practiced. The moral dimensions of Pascal's approach to persuasion included his insistence that religious communication must serve authentic spiritual welfare rather than merely winning intellectual victories or advancing institutional interests, requiring forms of humility and compassion that put truth above personal recognition, while maintaining scholarly standards that could satisfy legitimate demands for evidence and logical consistency. The practical applications of Pascal's theoretical insights about religious persuasion included specific strategies for addressing common objections to Christianity, while providing positive arguments for faith that could appeal to both rational and emotional aspects of human nature, demonstrating how apologetic writing could combine systematic theology with psychological realism to create effective instruments for spiritual education and evangelistic outreach. The experimental character of Pascal's apologetic method included his willingness to try different approaches with different audiences, while learning from both successes and failures how religious truth could be communicated more effectively, showing how genuine commitment to evangelical goals required flexibility and creativity that could adapt traditional Christian teachings to contemporary intellectual and cultural circumstances without compromising essential doctrinal content. The international influence that Pascal's approach to religious communication would exercise included its impact on subsequent apologetic literature throughout Europe and America that adopted his insights about psychological realism and rhetorical sophistication while applying them to different cultural contexts and theological traditions, establishing precedents for religious education that combined intellectual rigor with pastoral sensitivity in defense of Christian truth. The literary legacy that Pascal's work on religious persuasion created included its contribution to development of French prose style and philosophical literature that could address ultimate questions through forms of expression that achieve both artistic excellence and intellectual precision, providing models for religious writing that influenced subsequent generations of theologians, philosophers, and literary artists who sought to communicate spiritual truth through secular cultural forms. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's insights about religious communication included their applicability to modern discussions about faith and science, rational inquiry, and spiritual commitment, individual autonomy and religious authority that continued to require sophisticated approaches to intellectual and cultural challenges that purely traditional or purely rationalist methods might not be able to address adequately through conventional theological or philosophical approaches. Blaise Pascal's art of persuasion had demonstrated how religious truth could be communicated effectively to skeptical and sophisticated audiences while maintaining both intellectual integrity and spiritual authenticity, establishing new standards for apologetic literature that combined rational argument with psychological insight and literary artistry in defense of Christian faith that could appeal to both mind and heart without sacrificing either scholarly rigor or evangelical effectiveness. Chapter 10. The Unfinished Apology. During the final years of his life, From 1658 to 1662, Pascal devoted most of his remaining intellectual energy to developing what he envisioned as a comprehensive apology for the Christian religion that would demonstrate how faith could satisfy both rational and existential needs while addressing objections that skeptical intellectuals raised against traditional religious claims. This ambitious project, which remained tragically incomplete at his death, was intended to provide systematic defense of Christianity that could convince educated readers through arguments that combined logical rigor with psychological penetration and literary artistry. The overall structure that Pascal planned for his apology included two main sections. The first would demonstrate the limitations of human reason and the inadequacy of purely secular approaches to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose, while the second would show how Christian revelation provided satisfactory resolution of problems that philosophy and science could illuminate but not solve, creating a comprehensive case for faith that proceeded through careful analysis of human needs and rational capabilities, rather than relying on external authority or supernatural evidence alone. The anthropological foundation for Pascal's apologetic strategy required detailed examination of human nature that would reveal both the greatness and misery that characterized human existence, showing how human beings possessed remarkable rational and moral capacities while remaining subject to limitations and contradictions that no amount of intellectual or moral development could completely overcome through purely human effort, pointing toward the necessity of divine grace and revelation for authentic fulfillment and spiritual peace. The epistemological arguments that Pascal developed for his apology included sophisticated analysis of the relationship between different forms of knowledge, demonstrating how mathematical certainty, empirical observation, and rational demonstration had appropriate spheres of application, while remaining inadequate for addressing questions about ultimate meaning and value that required forms of wisdom that combined intellectual understanding with spiritual insight and moral transformation. The historical evidence that Pascal intended to incorporate into his defense of Christianity included careful examination of biblical texts, early church history, and contemporary religious experience that could provide empirical support for Christian claims, while acknowledging legitimate scholarly concerns about textual criticism, historical methodology, and the relationship between natural and supernatural causation that affected interpretation of religious documents and miraculous events. The philosophical components of Pascal's apology addressed fundamental questions about existence, causation, and moral obligation that had been raised by ancient skeptics and contemporary rationalists, showing how Christian teachings provided more adequate responses to these perennial problems than alternative philosophical systems, while maintaining intellectual standards that could satisfy educated audiences who demanded logical consistency and empirical support for metaphysical claims. The literary techniques that Pascal employed in his apologetic fragments included dialogue, paradox, and psychological analysis that engaged readers' imagination and moral sensibility while presenting complex arguments in accessible language that could appeal to both scholarly and popular audiences without sacrificing intellectual sophistication or theological accuracy that serious religious education required for effectiveness with skeptical readers. The fragmentary character of Pascal's surviving apologetic materials reflected both the incomplete state of his project at death and his experimental approach to developing arguments that would be tested through discussion and revision before being incorporated into final systematic presentation, demonstrating how genuine intellectual work required willingness to revise conclusions based on new evidence and more adequate analysis, rather than defending initial positions, regardless of their limitations. The theological sophistication that Pascal brought to his apologetic project included thorough knowledge of patristic sources, scholastic methodology, and contemporary controversies, while maintaining commitment to Augustinian insights about grace and predestination that had been refined through Jansenist scholarship and personal spiritual experience that provided experiential foundation for doctrinal claims about divine human relationships and the necessity of supernatural assistance for authentic spiritual development. The psychological realism that characterized Pascal's approach to religious apologetics included his recognition that intellectual conviction and spiritual transformation involved different psychological processes that required coordination rather than competition, showing how rational arguments could prepare the mind for faith, while spiritual disciplines could dispose the heart toward beliefs that reason alone could not establish with sufficient certainty to motivate practical commitment. The social analysis that Pascal incorporated into his defense of Christianity revealed how individual spiritual needs were affected by cultural circumstances and institutional arrangements that could either facilitate or obstruct religious development, providing frameworks for evaluating different approaches to religious education and community organization based on their effectiveness in promoting authentic faith rather than merely external conformity or institutional loyalty. The pedagogical principles that guided Pascal's apologetic methodology emphasized the importance of beginning with shared human experiences and common rational principles, rather than immediately introducing controversial religious doctrines, creating opportunities for readers to discover religious truth through their own reflection and analysis, rather than accepting conclusions on external authority that might not provide adequate foundation for sustained spiritual commitment. The experimental character of Pascal's apologetic work included his willingness to try different argumentative strategies while learning from both intellectual and spiritual sources how religious truth could be communicated most effectively to contemporary audiences, demonstrating how genuine commitment to evangelical goals required flexibility and creativity that could adapt traditional Christian teachings to modern intellectual circumstances without compromising essential doctrinal content. The influence that Pascal's incomplete apology would exercise on subsequent Christian thought included its demonstration of how rational argument and literary artistry could serve apologetic purposes while maintaining theological sophistication and spiritual authenticity, establishing precedents for religious education that combined scholarly rigor with pastoral concern in defense of Christian truth that could appeal to both intellectual and existential needs. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's apologetic approach included its applicability to modern discussions about faith and reason, scientific materialism, and religious belief, individual autonomy and spiritual authority that continued to require sophisticated responses to intellectual challenges that purely traditional or purely rationalist approaches might not be able to address adequately through conventional theological or philosophical methods. The literary legacy that Pascal's apology fragments created included their contribution to development of philosophical literature that could address ultimate questions through forms of expression that achieve both intellectual precision and artistic excellence, providing models for religious writing that influenced subsequent generations of theologians, philosophers, and literary artists who sought to defend spiritual truth through secular cultural forms and rational argumentation. Blaise Pascal's unfinished apology represented one of the most ambitious and sophisticated attempts in Christian intellectual history to demonstrate how religious faith could satisfy both rational and existential needs while addressing legitimate objections that skeptical intellectuals raised against traditional religious claims, establishing new standards for apologetic literature that combined systematic theology with psychological insight and literary artistry in defense of Christian truth. Chapter 11. The Dark Night of Reason. In the later years of his life, as Pascal struggled with declining health while working on his ambitious apologetic project, he experienced what might be described as a philosophical and spiritual dark night that tested his faith as severely as physical pain tested his endurance. This period of intellectual and spiritual trial revealed the depth of his commitment to truth over comfort, while demonstrating how even the most sophisticated rational defenses of religious belief could not eliminate the fundamental uncertainty and existential anxiety that seemed to characterize authentic spiritual existence in a universe that offered both mathematical order and ultimate mystery. The intellectual challenges that confronted Pascal during this period included his growing recognition that the rational arguments he was developing for his apology, however sophisticated and logically compelling, could not provide the kind of absolute certainty that skeptical critics demanded, while remaining vulnerable to objections that, though not conclusive, could generate sufficient doubt to undermine practical commitment to religious beliefs that required more than merely probable support for life-transforming acceptance and sustained spiritual practice. The psychological dimensions of Pascal's spiritual struggles included periods of doubt and depression that seemed to contradict his earlier mystical experience, while raising questions about the reliability of religious conviction that depended on subjective spiritual states rather than objective empirical evidence or logical demonstration, forcing him to confront fundamental problems about the relationship between faith and feeling, rational argument, and personal experience. systematic theology, and individual spiritual development. The physical suffering that Pascal endured through chronic illness provided unwelcome but instructive education in human limitation and mortality, while testing his theological convictions about divine providence and the problem of evil that rational analysis could illuminate but not resolve satisfactorily, creating conditions where abstract philosophical questions became personally urgent problems that required existential rather than merely theoretical responses. The social isolation that Pascal experienced as his health declined and his intellectual interests became increasingly focused on religious questions that many of his former colleagues considered irrelevant or inappropriate for serious scholarly attention, contributed to forms of loneliness and alienation that challenged his understanding of human nature and divine grace, while providing opportunities for more intensive spiritual reflection that might not have been possible under normal social circumstances. The theological questions that preoccupied Pascal during this difficult period included fundamental problems about predestination and free will, divine justice and human suffering, the hiddenness of God, and the necessity of faith that had been central to Christian thought since Augustine. But that assumed new urgency when considered from the perspective of someone experiencing both intellectual doubt and spiritual dryness, while attempting to maintain religious commitment despite psychological and physical adversity. The epistemological implications of Pascal's intellectual struggles revealed how even the most rigorous rational analysis remained inadequate for establishing religious truth with the kind of certainty that mathematical demonstration could achieve, while purely empirical approaches to spiritual questions seemed to miss essential dimensions of religious experience that could not be captured through observational methods or experimental investigation that worked effectively for understanding physical phenomena but might not apply to spiritual reality. The literary expression that Pascal gave to his spiritual difficulties through fragments that would later be included in the Pens Es demonstrated how philosophical investigation could be conducted through personal reflection and artistic expression that captured essential features of human experience while maintaining intellectual rigor and theological sophistication, creating forms of religious literature that combined scholarly analysis with existential authenticity. The moral implications of Pascal's encounter with spiritual darkness included recognition that authentic faith might require acceptance of uncertainty and mystery that philosophical demonstration could not eliminate, while genuine spiritual development demanded forms of humility and trust that intellectual pride and rational autonomy could actually obstruct rather than facilitate, challenging conventional assumptions about the relationship between knowledge and virtue that had dominated Christian thought since the scholastic period. The cultural context for Pascal's spiritual struggles included the broader intellectual crisis of 17th-century European culture that was witnessing fundamental challenges to traditional religious authority through scientific discoveries and philosophical criticism that raised questions about the reliability of revelation and the necessity of supernatural explanation for natural phenomena, creating conditions where thoughtful individuals could no longer accept conventional religious teachings without serious intellectual and spiritual wrestling. The therapeutic possibilities that Pascal discovered through his experience of spiritual trial included recognition that doubt and darkness might serve important functions in authentic spiritual development by eliminating false certainties and superficial consolations while driving sincere seekers toward more adequate understanding of divine reality and human nature that could not be achieved through comfortable religious conformity or purely intellectual approaches to ultimate questions. The apologetic insights that emerged from Pascal's personal spiritual struggles informed his understanding of how religious arguments could be most effectively presented to skeptical audiences by acknowledging genuine difficulties and limitations, rather than claiming more certainty than evidence could support, demonstrating how intellectual honesty and spiritual authenticity could enhance rather than undermine the credibility of Christian claims about divine reality and human destiny. The mystical dimensions of Pascal's dark night included his growing appreciation for the hiddenness of God as an essential feature of divine reality rather than merely a temporary obstacle to religious knowledge, recognizing that spiritual truth might necessarily remain partially concealed in order to preserve the freedom and moral responsibility that authentic relationship with divine reality required rather than coerced acceptance based on overwhelming evidence that would eliminate genuine choice. The philosophical significance of Pascal's spiritual trials included their contribution to his understanding of human nature, as fundamentally characterized by what he described as disproportion, suspended between finite limitations and infinite aspirations in ways that created perpetual restlessness and dissatisfaction that no amount of intellectual achievement or material success could permanently resolve without spiritual transformation that addressed the deepest needs of human consciousness and moral aspiration. The pedagogical value of Pascal's experience with spiritual darkness provided practical guidance for others who might face similar challenges to faith, while demonstrating how intellectual and spiritual difficulties could be approached with resources that neither purely rational analysis or purely emotional consolation could supply adequately, requiring integration of systematic theology with personal spiritual practice and community support that could sustain religious commitment through periods of uncertainty and trial. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's encounter with the dark night of reason included its applicability to modern discussions about faith and doubt, intellectual honesty, and religious commitment, individual autonomy and spiritual authority that continued to affect thoughtful individuals who sought authentic relationship with ultimate reality, while maintaining integrity about the limitations of human knowledge and the complexity of spiritual development that purely secular or purely traditional approaches might not adequately address. Blaise Pascal's Dark Night of Reason had tested the depth of his religious commitment while revealing how authentic spiritual development might require acceptance of uncertainty and mystery that no amount of intellectual sophistication could eliminate, teaching him about forms of faith that could survive rational criticism while providing foundation for spiritual life that transcended purely philosophical approaches to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. Chapter 12. The Geometry of Grace. Despite his spiritual struggles and declining health, Pascal continued during his final years to develop what may have been his most original theological insight: the recognition that divine grace operated according to principles that could be analyzed with mathematical precision while remaining ultimately mysterious in their source and application. This insight, which emerged from his attempt to reconcile his scientific understanding of natural law with his religious conviction about supernatural intervention, led him to explore how geometric methods and probabilistic reasoning could illuminate spiritual processes without reducing them to merely mechanical operations that eliminated genuine freedom and moral responsibility. The mathematical framework that Pascal applied to theological questions drew on his understanding of infinite series and calculus to analyze how divine action could work through natural causes while transcending the limitations that seemed to constrain purely material processes, suggesting that grace operated through orders of reality that were related to, but distinct from the physical universe that scientific investigation could describe through empirical observation and mathematical formulation. The theological sophistication that Pascal brought to his analysis of grace included thorough familiarity with Augustinian and Thomistic discussions of divine-human cooperation, while incorporating insights from his own spiritual experience and contemporary Jansenist scholarship that emphasized the absolute necessity of supernatural assistance for authentic moral and spiritual development that natural, human faculties could not achieve through their own efforts, regardless of how carefully they were cultivated and disciplined. The philosophical implications of Pascal's geometric approach to grace included fundamental questions about the relationship between divine sovereignty and human freedom that had preoccupied Christian thinkers since Augustine, while requiring new conceptual frameworks that could accommodate both scientific understanding of natural causation and religious conviction about supernatural intervention, without reducing either to merely apparent or merely mechanical processes that eliminated genuine agency and moral responsibility. The practical applications of Pascal's theological insights included their relevance for understanding how prayer and spiritual disciplines could serve authentic purposes without attempting to manipulate divine action according to human preferences, recognizing that genuine spiritual development required cooperation with grace while remaining dependent on divine initiative that could not be controlled or predicted through human effort or calculation, though it might be analyzed retrospectively through mathematical methods that revealed patterns without explaining ultimate causes. The mystical dimensions of Pascal's geometric theology included his recognition that infinite divine reality necessarily transcended finite human comprehension, while remaining accessible through forms of knowledge that combined rational analysis with spiritual intuition and moral transformation, suggesting that mathematical methods could point towards spiritual truth without claiming to capture or control divine mystery that remained essentially beyond human understanding, despite genuine insights that careful investigation could achieve. The pedagogical value of Pascal's mathematical approach to theological questions included its potential for helping educated individuals understand how scientific methodology and religious faith could complement rather than compete with each other when properly understood and appropriately applied to questions that required both rational analysis and spiritual wisdom for adequate comprehension and practical application to moral and spiritual development. The apologetic possibilities that Pascal saw in his geometric analysis of grace included opportunities for demonstrating to skeptical intellectuals that religious claims about supernatural intervention could be formulated with logical precision while maintaining respect for empirical evidence and mathematical consistency, showing how faith and reason could work together to address ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that neither purely rational or purely empirical approaches could resolve adequately through independent investigation. The cultural significance of Pascal's theological innovations included their contribution to broader European discussions about the relationship between scientific revolution and religious tradition that were reshaping intellectual culture throughout the 17th century, while raising fundamental questions about the compatibility of modern natural philosophy with traditional Christian teaching that required sophisticated theological and philosophical analysis for adequate resolution. The literary expression that Pascal gave to his insights about grace through fragments that would later be included in the Pensiers demonstrated how mathematical concepts could be incorporated into religious discourse without reducing spiritual truth to merely quantitative relationships, creating forms of theological writing that combined analytical precision with poetic sensibility and spiritual authenticity that could appeal to both rational and imaginative dimensions of human consciousness. The experimental character of Pascal's theological methodology included his willingness to apply mathematical tools to spiritual questions while remaining open to revision based on further investigation and spiritual development, demonstrating how genuine intellectual work required flexibility and humility that could acknowledge limitations while pursuing truth through whatever methods seemed most promising for advancing understanding rather than defending predetermined conclusions, regardless of their adequacy. The influence that Pascal's geometric approach to grace would exercise on subsequent Christian thought included its contribution to discussions about natural theology, the relationship between faith and reason, and the proper scope of mathematical analysis in addressing ultimate questions that remained relevant for theologians and philosophers who sought to integrate scientific knowledge with religious conviction without compromising either empirical accuracy or spiritual authenticity. The limitations that critics would identify in Pascal's mathematical theology included questions about whether geometric methods could adequately address spiritual realities that might require fundamentally different approaches to knowledge, whether probabilistic analysis could capture the personal dimensions of divine-human relationship that seemed essential to authentic religious experience, and whether systematic approaches to grace might reduce mystery and freedom to technical problems that admitted purely rational solutions. The psychological insights that Pascal developed through his analysis of grace included recognition that spiritual transformation involved changes in consciousness and character that could be observed and described with scientific precision while remaining dependent on divine action that transcended purely natural psychological processes, suggesting that human personality development required both empirical understanding and spiritual resources that purely secular approaches to mental health and moral education might not be able to provide adequately. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's geometric theology included its anticipation of modern discussions about the relationship between scientific determinism and human freedom, the role of probability in understanding complex systems, and the possibility of naturalistic explanations for phenomena that had traditionally been attributed to supernatural causes, questions that continued to affect how thoughtful individuals understood the relationship between scientific knowledge and religious faith. The spiritual significance of Pascal's mathematical approach to grace included its reflection of his conviction that divine reality was both rationally comprehensible and ultimately mysterious, requiring forms of investigation that combined intellectual rigor with spiritual sensitivity, while maintaining humble recognition that human understanding, however sophisticated, remained finite and partial when confronted with infinite divine truth that called for worship and obedience as well as analytical investigation. Blaise Pascal's geometry of grace represented his most original contribution to Christian theology, while demonstrating how mathematical genius could be applied to spiritual questions without reducing religious truth to merely technical problems, establishing precedents for theological investigation that combined scientific methodology with spiritual wisdom in defense of divine mystery that transcended while including rational analysis and empirical investigation. Chapter 13: The Weight of Suffering. During the final years of his life, Pascal's chronic illnesses intensified to the point where physical pain became his constant companion, providing unwelcome but instructive education in human limitation and mortality that complemented his intellectual understanding of finite existence, while testing his theological convictions about divine providence and the problem of suffering that rational analysis could illuminate but not resolve in ways that eliminated existential anguish and spiritual struggle that seemed intrinsic to authentic religious commitment. The medical conditions that afflicted Pascal during his 30s included severe digestive problems, chronic headaches, and what appears to have been a form of temporal lobe dysfunction that produced both physical pain and neurological symptoms that affected his sleep, concentration, and emotional equilibrium, while creating conditions where ordinary daily activities became sources of struggle that required constant effort and adaptation to circumstances that remained largely beyond his control, despite the best medical knowledge available. The psychological impact of chronic illness on Pascal's intellectual work included both the limitations that pain imposed on sustained concentration and the insights that physical suffering provided into human nature and the relationship between mind and body that purely theoretical investigation might not have revealed with comparable clarity and existential urgency, demonstrating how personal experience could complement and correct abstract philosophical analysis through direct encounter with realities that systematic thinking might overlook or misunderstand. The theological questions that Pascal's suffering raised about divine justice and providential care became increasingly urgent as abstract problems about evil and suffering that Christian thinkers had debated for centuries transformed into personal challenges that required existential rather than merely theoretical responses, forcing him to confront fundamental problems about the compatibility of divine goodness with human misery that philosophical arguments could illuminate but not resolve in ways that provided lasting comfort or intellectual satisfaction. The spiritual dimensions of Pascal's encounter with chronic pain included his growing appreciation for how physical suffering could serve purposes in spiritual development that comfortable circumstances might not facilitate, recognizing that adversity could promote forms of humility, dependence on divine grace, and compassion for others' difficulties that prosperity and health might actually obstruct through encouraging self-reliance and spiritual complacency that prevented authentic relationship with God and neighbor. The practical adjustments that Pascal's declining health required included modifications to his daily routines, social relationships, and intellectual projects that demonstrated how external circumstances could force changes in priorities and commitments while providing opportunities for discovering what was truly essential for personal satisfaction and spiritual development, as distinguished from conventional expectations about appropriate activities for individuals of his intellectual stature and social position. The literary expression that Pascal gave to his experience with suffering through fragments that would later be included in the Pensiers revealed how physical pain could become material for theological reflection and apologetic argument that combined personal authenticity with universal relevance, creating forms of religious writing that addressed questions about meaning and purpose that arose directly from human experience rather than abstract philosophical speculation that might lack existential urgency and practical application. The social implications of Pascal's chronic illness included the ways that physical limitation affected his ability to participate in normal intellectual and cultural activities, while teaching him about human interdependence and the importance of community support for individuals facing circumstances that challenged their capacity for self-sufficiency and independent achievement. providing practical education in humility and mutual aid that complemented his theoretical understanding of human nature and social obligation. The philosophical significance of Pascal's encounter with suffering included its contribution to his analysis of human condition, as characterized by fundamental disproportion between infinite aspirations and finite capabilities, that created perpetual dissatisfaction and restlessness that could be addressed but never completely resolved through human effort alone, requiring forms of spiritual transformation and divine assistance that transcended purely rational or moral approaches to achieving authentic fulfillment and peace. The apologetic value that Pascal extracted from his personal experience with pain included insights into how suffering could serve educational and purifying functions that might not be apparent to individuals who had not faced similar challenges, enabling him to address skeptical objections about the problem of evil with authority that came from lived experience rather than merely theoretical analysis, though without claiming that personal suffering automatically validated religious explanations or eliminated legitimate questions about divine justice. The medical investigations that Pascal pursued in attempting to understand and treat his conditions provided additional evidence of the limitations of contemporary scientific knowledge, while demonstrating how empirical investigation could advance understanding of natural phenomena without necessarily providing practical solutions to problems that affected human welfare, revealing tensions between scientific progress and human need that raised questions about the ultimate value and proper scope of rational inquiry and technical expertise. The moral insights that Pascal developed through his experience with chronic illness included recognition that suffering could either promote virtue or encourage vice, depending on how individuals responded to circumstances that tested their character and spiritual resources, showing how adversity could serve as occasion for growth in patience, compassion, and trust in divine providence, or could produce bitterness, self-pity, and despair that corrupted personality and damaged relationships with others. The therapeutic possibilities that Pascal discovered through his encounter with pain included spiritual disciplines and intellectual activities that could provide meaning and purpose despite physical limitations, while demonstrating how authentic human fulfillment might not depend primarily on health, comfort, or external circumstances, but rather on internal spiritual resources and divine relationship that could sustain individuals through difficulties that challenge conventional assumptions about what constituted successful or meaningful existence. The cultural context for Pascal's experience with suffering included broader European discussions about the relationship between physical and spiritual reality that were being influenced by scientific discoveries and philosophical analysis that raised questions about traditional Christian teachings regarding the soul, resurrection, and the ultimate significance of bodily existence that affected how thoughtful individuals understood the meaning and purpose of physical pain and mortality that all human beings necessarily faced. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's encounter with chronic illness included its applicability to modern discussions about pain management, quality of life, and the relationship between physical health and spiritual well-being that continued to challenge medical professionals, philosophers, and theologians who sought to understand how technological advances and scientific knowledge could serve authentic human flourishing rather than merely extending life or eliminating discomfort without addressing deeper questions about meaning and purpose. The educational value that Pascal's experience with suffering provided included practical guidance for others facing similar challenges, while demonstrating how personal difficulties could be transformed into opportunities for intellectual and spiritual development that might not have been available under more comfortable circumstances. Though without romanticizing pain or suggesting that suffering was necessary or desirable for authentic human development rather than simply an unavoidable feature of finite existence. Blaise Pascal's weight of suffering had tested his theological convictions and philosophical insights while providing material for some of his most profound reflections on human nature and divine reality, demonstrating how personal experience with limitation and pain could complement and deepen intellectual understanding, while creating forms of wisdom that purely theoretical investigation might not be able to achieve through rational analysis alone. Chapter 14. The Final Calculations. In August 1662, As 39-year-old Blaise Pascal lay dying in his sister Jacqueline's apartment in Paris, his mind remained remarkably clear despite physical deterioration that had reduced him to a shadow of the brilliant young man who had once amazed Europe's leading intellectuals with mathematical innovations and scientific discoveries. The approach of death provided final opportunity for reflection on questions that had occupied his intellectual and spiritual attention for decades, while creating circumstances where ultimate concerns about meaning and destiny could no longer be deferred or approached through purely theoretical investigation. The medical diagnosis that explained Pascal's final illness included what appears to have been a brain tumor or severe meningitis that produced intense headaches, convulsions, and gradual loss of physical functions while leaving his intellectual faculties largely intact until very near the end, enabling him to maintain conscious participation in conversations about religious and philosophical questions that had defined his mature intellectual life, while facing the practical reality of approaching death that transformed abstract speculation about mortality into immediate personal experience. The spiritual preparation that Pascal undertook during his final weeks included intensive participation in religious observances and contemplative practices that demonstrated his continued commitment to the faith that had guided his life since his conversion experience 8 years earlier, while providing practical validation of religious convictions that had been developed through both rational argument and mystical experience, but now required testing through the ultimate human challenge that no amount of intellectual sophistication could avoid or resolve through purely rational means. The intellectual legacy that Pascal was conscious of leaving included his contributions to mathematics, physics, and religious philosophy that had established his reputation among Europe's leading thinkers, while remaining incomplete in ways that reflected both the limitations of individual human achievement and the ongoing nature of intellectual investigation that each generation would need to continue based on insights and methods that previous scholars had developed but could not bring to final completion or systematic closure. The family relationships that provided emotional support during Pascal's final illness included the devoted care of his sister Jacqueline, who had herself embraced religious life while maintaining intellectual interests that enabled meaningful conversation about spiritual and philosophical questions, as well as continued connection with his sister Gilbert and her family, who represented more conventional approaches to combining intellectual sophistication with social responsibility and domestic commitment. The theological questions that preoccupied Pascal during his final weeks included fundamental problems about salvation, divine judgment, and eternal destiny that had been central to his religious thought, while assuming new urgency when considered from the perspective of someone facing death, who needed practical assurance about spiritual matters rather than merely theoretical understanding of doctrinal issues that might remain academically interesting but existentially irrelevant for individuals confronting ultimate reality. The practical arrangements that Pascal made for his intellectual remains included provisions for the preservation and potential publication of his fragmentary writings on religious apologetics, though he remained characteristically modest about their value while recognizing that ideas he had developed might prove useful for others who faced similar intellectual and spiritual challenges in attempting to reconcile rational analysis with religious commitment in cultural circumstances that made traditional forms of faith increasingly difficult to maintain without serious intellectual wrestling. The psychological equanimity that Pascal maintained during his final illness reflected both his philosophical understanding of human mortality and his religious conviction about divine providence that enabled him to face death without the terror or desperation that might have been expected from someone whose extraordinary intellectual gifts and social position provided numerous reasons for wanting to continue living and working on projects that remained incomplete at his death. The physical suffering that accompanied Pascal's final weeks provided additional education in human limitation and dependence, while testing spiritual resources that had been developed through years of contemplative practice and theological reflection, demonstrating how abstract religious convictions could provide practical support during circumstances that challenge all merely human forms of comfort and security, while requiring ultimate trust in divine mercy and providence. The social recognition that Pascal's approaching death generated among Parisian intellectual and religious circles reflected widespread appreciation for his contributions to multiple fields of knowledge, while revealing how individual achievement could inspire respect and affection among colleagues and readers who might not share his specific religious commitments, but could recognize the integrity and brilliance that had characterized his intellectual career and personal spiritual development. The literary projects that Pascal was unable to complete included his comprehensive apology for Christianity that would have provided systematic defense of religious faith against skeptical objections, while demonstrating how rational argument and spiritual insight could work together to address ultimate questions about meaning and purpose that neither purely secular nor purely traditional approaches seemed adequate to resolve through independent methods of investigation and analysis. The mathematical insights that Pascal had developed throughout his career provided frameworks for understanding probability and decision-making under uncertainty that proved relevant for approaching questions about religious choice and spiritual commitment that could not be resolved through purely logical demonstration, but required forms of practical wisdom that combined rational analysis with existential commitment to values and beliefs that transcended empirical verification while remaining consistent with careful observation and mathematical reasoning. The scientific contributions that established Pascal's permanent place in the history of physics and mathematics included his work on atmospheric pressure, probability theory, and mechanical calculation that demonstrated how human reason could discover reliable knowledge about natural phenomena, while revealing limitations of purely empirical approaches when applied to questions about ultimate meaning and purpose that seemed to require different forms of investigation and different criteria for evaluating truth. Claims about spiritual reality. The religious influence that Pascal's life and work would exercise on subsequent Christian thought included his demonstration of how intellectual sophistication could serve, rather than threaten authentic religious commitment, while providing resources for addressing modern challenges to traditional faith that required new forms of apologetic argument and spiritual witness that could appeal to educated audiences without compromising essential Christian teachings about divine reality and human destiny. The cultural significance of Pascal's intellectual achievement included his contribution to broader European discussions about the relationship between scientific knowledge and religious faith that were reshaping intellectual culture during the 17th century, while establishing precedents for approaching ultimate questions through methods that combined rational rigor with spiritual sensitivity in defense of truths that transcended purely rational demonstration without contradicting logical consistency or empirical accuracy. The personal satisfaction that Pascal derived from his intellectual and spiritual development included recognition that he had devoted his extraordinary gifts to purposes that served both individual fulfillment and broader human welfare, while maintaining integrity about the limitations of human knowledge and the necessity of divine grace for authentic spiritual development that could address the deepest needs and highest aspirations that characterized human consciousness and moral experience. Blaise Pascal's final calculations included both mathematical and spiritual reckonings that demonstrated how intellectual genius could be integrated with religious commitment while providing resources for understanding human nature and divine reality that would influence subsequent generations of thinkers who sought to address ultimate questions about existence and purpose with both rational sophistication and spiritual authenticity.
Chapter 15. The Last Wager. On August 19, 1662, at 1 o'clock in the morning,
Blaise
Pascal died peacefully in his sister's arms after receiving the last sacraments of the Catholic Church. Surrounded by family members and clergy who had supported his final spiritual journey while witnessing the calm dignity with which he faced death after a life devoted to pursuing truth through both rational investigation and religious commitment. His final words, according to those present, included expressions of faith and requests for divine mercy that reflected the theological convictions he had developed through years of intellectual struggle and spiritual development. The immediate cause of Pascal's death was likely a brain hemorrhage or tumor that had been producing the severe headaches and neurological symptoms that plagued his final weeks, while leaving his mental faculties largely intact until the last few days, enabling him to maintain conscious participation in religious observances and family conversations that provided opportunities for final reflections on questions that had defined his mature intellectual and spiritual life. The funeral arrangements that were made for Pascal reflected his family's social position and his scholarly reputation while remaining modest in scale. As he had requested during his final illness that his burial be conducted without elaborate ceremony or public display that might draw attention to worldly achievements rather than spiritual significance of death that reminded all observers of human mortality and dependence on divine mercy, regardless of intellectual distinction or social status. The immediate response to Pascal's death among European intellectual circles included recognition of his extraordinary contributions to mathematics, physics, and religious philosophy, while acknowledging that many of his most important insights remained fragmentary and incomplete, requiring careful preservation and editorial work before they could achieve the influence on subsequent thought that his genius deserved and that contemporary readers were beginning to anticipate based on preliminary exposure to his writings. The family's decision to preserve Pascal's personal papers and literary remains included their recognition that his fragmentary writings on religious apologetics contained insights that might prove valuable for other individuals. Facing similar intellectual and spiritual challenges and attempting to reconcile scientific knowledge with religious faith, though they remained uncertain about how such materials could be organized and published in ways that would serve their authors' intentions while reaching appropriate audiences. The editorial challenges that confronted those responsible for Pascal's literary legacy included the fragmentary and experimental character of his religious writings that had been composed as notes and reflections, rather than finished treatises intended for publication, requiring careful interpretation and organization to present his insights coherently while respecting the incomplete state in which death had left projects that might have developed quite differently if he had lived to complete them according to his original intentions. The theological impact that Pascal's death created among French religious communities included both appreciation for his defense of Augustinian theology against Jesuit opposition and recognition that his approach to religious questions had established new possibilities for combining intellectual sophistication with spiritual commitment that could influence subsequent development of Christian thought and apologetic literature in ways that purely academic or purely devotional approaches might not achieve. The scientific legacy that Pascal left through his contributions to mathematics and physics included fundamental insights into probability theory, atmospheric pressure, and mechanical calculation that would influence subsequent development of these fields while demonstrating how individual genius could advance human knowledge through careful observation and mathematical analysis that revealed previously unknown aspects of natural reality and logical relationships. The literary influence that Pascal's writings would exercise on subsequent French culture included his establishment of new possibilities for philosophical prose that combined analytical precision, literary artistry, while addressing ultimate questions about human nature and divine reality through forms of expression that could appeal to both rational and imaginative dimensions of consciousness, providing models for serious writing that achieved both intellectual and aesthetic excellence. The philosophical significance of Pascal's intellectual achievement included his contribution to modern discussions about the relationship between reason and faith, scientific knowledge and religious commitment, individual autonomy, and spiritual authority that established frameworks for addressing ultimate questions that remained relevant for subsequent generations of thinkers who sought to understand human nature and cosmic reality, without reducing either to purely material processes or purely spiritual abstractions. The international recognition that Pascal's work would eventually receive included its influence on British empiricism, idealism, and American pragmatism that found in his insights about probability, decision-making, and the limitations of human knowledge resources for addressing epistemological and theological questions that continued to challenge philosophers and theologians who sought adequate responses to modern intellectual and cultural developments. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's intellectual legacy included its applicability to modern discussions about scientific methodology and religious experience, rational analysis, and existential commitment, individual choice and social responsibility that demonstrated how 17th century insights could illuminate 21st century challenges while providing resources for addressing questions that purely secular or purely traditional approaches might not resolve adequately through independent investigation. The pedagogical value that Pascal's life and work provided included practical guidance for individuals seeking to integrate intellectual sophistication with spiritual development while maintaining integrity about both the possibilities and limitations of human knowledge when applied to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. That required forms of wisdom that combined rational analysis with moral sensitivity and spiritual insight. The spiritual significance of Pascal's death for his immediate family and religious community included recognition that he had achieved the kind of authentic Christian existence that his theological writings had described and defended, demonstrating through personal example how intellectual gifts could serve spiritual purposes while providing witness to religious truth that transcended purely rational demonstration without contradicting logical consistency or empirical accuracy when properly understood. The cultural transformation that Pascal's intellectual achievement would eventually produce included its contribution to the development of modern probability theory, computer science, and decision analysis that established him as one of the founding fathers of quantitative approaches to uncertainty and choice that would revolutionize economics, psychology, and political science while maintaining relevance for addressing fundamental questions about rational action under conditions of incomplete information. The religious influence that Pascal's apologetic work would exercise on subsequent Christian thought included its demonstration of how rational argument could serve evangelical purposes while maintaining intellectual honesty about the limitations of purely logical approaches to spiritual questions, establishing precedents for religious education that could address skeptical objections while promoting authentic faith through methods that respected both human reason and divine mystery. Blaise Pascal had completed his final wager by choosing faith over doubt while maintaining intellectual integrity about uncertainty and mystery that no amount of rational analysis could eliminate, demonstrating through both his life and death how extraordinary intellectual gifts could serve spiritual purposes while providing lasting contributions to human knowledge and cultural development that transcended the limitations of individual mortality. Legacy, the calculator of the infinite. Within decades of Blaise Pascal's death, his fragmentary writings had been assembled into the Pensies that would become one of the most influential works in European literature, while his mathematical and scientific contributions established him as a founding father of probability theory, computer science, and modern physics. The man who had experienced the tension between reason and faith as both intellectual problem and existential crisis had created resources for addressing this fundamental modern dilemma that would remain relevant for centuries as European culture struggled to integrate scientific rationalism with spiritual meaning and individual authenticity. The immediate publication history of Pascal's works revealed the complexity of his intellectual achievement as editors struggled to organize fragmentary materials that had been composed for different purposes and audiences, while maintaining his distinctive voice and philosophical approach. The Pensies, published in Ililo, provided readers with access to one of the most psychologically penetrating analyses of human nature ever written, while his mathematical and scientific treatises established his technical contributions to fields that would develop into major intellectual disciplines. The influence of Pascal's approach to probability theory on subsequent mathematical development included his establishment of fundamental concepts and methods that would be refined by later mathematicians into sophisticated analytical tools for understanding uncertainty and making rational decisions under conditions of incomplete information. His correspondence with Fermat about gambling problems had initiated mathematical investigations that would eventually revolutionize economics, insurance, statistics, and scientific methodology, while providing conceptual foundations for modern computer science and artificial intelligence. The impact of Pascal's scientific work on the development of physics included his contributions to understanding atmospheric pressure and vacuum that helped establish experimental methodology as a reliable approach to investigating natural phenomena. His mechanical calculator demonstrated how mathematical principles could be embodied in physical devices that automated reasoning processes, anticipating developments in mechanical and electronic computation that would transform modern technology while raising questions about the relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. The theological significance of Pascal's religious writings for subsequent Christian thought included his sophisticated defense of faith against rationalist criticism that showed how religious commitment could maintain intellectual respectability while acknowledging the limitations of purely rational approaches to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. His analysis of human nature, divine grace, and spiritual development influenced both Protestant and Catholic theology, while providing resources for addressing modern challenges to traditional religious authority. The philosophical legacy of Pascal's work on the relationship between reason and faith established frameworks for discussing epistemological questions that remained central to modern intellectual culture as secular rationalism and religious tradition continued to compete for influence over individual consciousness and social organization. His insights about the limitations of human knowledge and the necessity of existential commitment despite uncertainty would influence existentialism, pragmatism, and postmodern philosophy, while maintaining relevance for contemporary discussions about science and religion. The literary achievement that Pascal's pensies represented included their demonstration of how fragmentary composition and aphoristic insight could achieve philosophical depth and psychological penetration that systematic treatises might not provide through conventional academic methods. His prose style influenced French literature while establishing precedents for philosophical writing that combined analytical precision with literary artistry and spiritual urgency in ways that appealed to both intellectual and popular audiences. The psychological insights that Pascal developed through his analysis of human consciousness, motivation, and character anticipated modern scientific psychology while maintaining appreciation for spiritual dimensions of human experience that purely empirical approaches might not adequately address. His understanding of self-deception, moral development, and the relationship between reason and emotion influenced subsequent investigations of human nature while providing practical wisdom for individuals seeking authentic self-knowledge and spiritual growth. The political implications of Pascal's individualistic approach to religious and moral questions contributed to modern concepts of personal autonomy and freedom of conscience that would influence liberal, democratic theory while maintaining recognition of human interdependence and social responsibility that purely individualistic philosophies might neglect. His analysis of authority, tradition, and individual judgment provided resources for addressing tensions between personal liberty and social order that remained relevant for modern democratic societies. The educational influence of Pascal's pedagogical insights included his emphasis on the importance of cultivating judgment rather than merely transmitting information. Recognizing individual differences in temperament and ability while maintaining standards of intellectual rigor and moral integrity, his understanding of how learning actually occurred through personal investigation and experiential engagement would influence educational reform movements that emphasized active participation in critical thinking rather than passive reception of authoritative instruction. The scientific methodology that Pascal helped establish through his experimental work and mathematical analysis contributed to the development of modern empirical investigation, while maintaining awareness of the limitations of purely quantitative approaches to understanding complex phenomena. His integration of theoretical insight with practical application provided models for scientific research that could serve both intellectual curiosity and human welfare, while acknowledging the moral and spiritual dimensions of scientific responsibility. The cultural criticism that Pascal developed through his analysis of human nature and social organization revealed how material prosperity and technological advancement could coexist with spiritual emptiness and moral corruption. Anticipating modern discussions about the relationship between scientific progress and authentic human flourishing, his insights about entertainment, distraction, and the human need for meaning remained relevant for understanding how modern media and consumer culture affected individual consciousness and social relationships. The international influence of Pascal's work extended beyond European culture to affect global intellectual development, as his writings were translated, and his mathematical insights were incorporated into scientific and philosophical investigations throughout the world. His demonstration of how individual genius could address universal human concerns while respecting cultural diversity and intellectual freedom provided inspiration for thinkers who sought to combine rigorous analysis with spiritual wisdom in addressing contemporary challenges. The contemporary relevance of Pascal's approach to uncertainty and decision-making included its applicability to modern problems in economics, public policy, medical ethics, and environmental planning that required rational analysis of complex situations where complete information was unavailable, but practical decisions could not be deferred until absolute certainty was achieved. His insights about probability and risk assessment remained essential for addressing technological and social challenges that characterize 21st century civilization. The therapeutic applications of Pascal's psychological insights included their relevance for modern counseling and psychotherapy that sought to address existential anxiety, spiritual confusion, and identity problems that affected individuals living in complex modern societies, where traditional sources of meaning and authority no longer provided adequate guidance for personal development and moral choice. His understanding of human nature offered resources for healing that combined intellectual sophistication with spiritual wisdom. The ongoing scholarly investigation of Pascal's intellectual achievement continued, revealing new dimensions of his contributions to mathematics, science, philosophy, and theology, while demonstrating how his synthetic approach to knowledge could illuminate connections between different fields of inquiry that specialized academic disciplines might not adequately address through purely disciplinary methods. His example of intellectual versatility and spiritual seriousness remained relevant for contemporary scholars who sought to integrate rigorous analysis with ultimate concerns about truth and meaning. Blaise Pascal's legacy as calculator of the infinite included his demonstration of how mathematical precision and spiritual, cold insight could complement rather than compete with each other in addressing ultimate questions about human nature and cosmic reality, providing lasting contributions to both scientific knowledge and religious understanding that continued influencing efforts to achieve authentic integration of reason and faith in pursuit of truth that served both intellectual curiosity and existential need.